Okay, so this one is going to be about how do I sum it up? So, a friend of mine is very interested in playing D&D, but their schedule is a huge issue. Being able to commit to, like, say, a weekly or even bi-weekly schedule is just a little too, we'll say, orderly for them. It's just their schedule just isn't going to work. They feel like they're going to miss like half the games, which, I mean, that's a thing that, adulthood is real. I'm sorry, that's how it is. So, what do you do if you still want to play? You still want to play D&D or tabletop or whatever. You still want to play D&D, but your schedule doesn't let you make every game. What if I had a better answer to this question? Solve everybody's scheduling problems forever. But unfortunately, I don't have some sort of silver bullet. Instead, all I have is you create a character that can slot or drop in and out. And you can do this with some game mechanics. I think I touched on this in some other videos. But there's lots of tables come up with solutions to do these things. Like, there's the standard stuff where, everybody usually can make it. But when a single player can't make it as a result of something, it's just, okay, their character's like kind of in the background, they don't say a whole lot, and one of the other players just runs them in combat. So that, they're not like down their paladin for a combat, and that could be bad. So, the character's just there, but they're quiet. I just did this in our Curse of Strahd game. Our Minotaur Barbarian hasn't made several sessions. So, that's a thing. But, this last session, I ran him in combat. Or, actually, this session, the session before that, and the session before that, I ran the Minotaur. And 2 of those sessions had combat in them. Barbarians aren't hard to run once you know how, as soon as you know how the game works, barbarians are one of the easiest characters to run. But, so that's one way to do it. It's simple, as long as the players usually can make it. But then another case, like, you have some sort of like specific game mechanic in place such that when a player can't make it, their character like disappears. This one's a little weird, and I've seen a bunch of different permutations of it. Like, when their player can't make it, the character goes into a harmless demi-plane and goes to sleep until the player gets back. And that's like, okay, that's a mechanical thing that happens, but like narratively, what happens? Like, how is it? What determines, like, in game, is from the character's perspective? What determines when the characters go into the demiplane and when they don't? Because unless you completely just metagame it and ignore it, the character should be like, any of us could disappear into the demiplane at any time. We have no idea why. There's no logical through line why it happens and when it happens. Sometimes it happens for like an hour. Sometimes it happens for days and weeks. Like, we have no idea. We're scared. So that's kind of unsatisfying to me, because there's the problem of from the character's perspective, unless you just completely ignore it on a metagame level. But another idea, or another one of this same kind of problem I've seen, a solution to the same kind of problem, is set it up so, like, whenever a whenever a player is missing, this like NPC shows up and grabs them. Functionally, it's like the same thing as the demiplane, but it's slightly different. Like, it's mechanically the same thing, but there's a different narrative thing, and then at least there's like, you can talk to that NPC and get some information, but again, it's still really unsatisfying. But, those are solutions to the shorter term version, where players that can usually make it, I can't make this week, then a thing happens. Or the character walks off to do something for that session because their player couldn't make it. Like, they go off and do something. That's easy in, like, if you happen to be in a town already. If you're not in a town, then you probably have to do the, like, okay, someone else will just run the character in combat, and they're just quiet otherwise. But if you can get the character out of there, that makes things easier. But that's not the original question that I had, right? The question I had was, what do you do when a player can't commit at all? Like, and they might be able to make, like, 1 out of every 4 sessions, something like that. Well, here's a little example that we never actually got to use. In the Erlmeyer campaign, we had a player that joined, like, fairly early on. And then they were having lots of scheduling difficulties. They just could not get their schedule together. They could not keep it straight. They couldn't remember when the game was. It was a whole thing. But because they happened to be a chronomancer wizard, that lent itself to a particular idea that I had. And it's, okay, when the player is there, the character is there. When the player isn't there, they skip down the time stream because they are using unstable time magic. So every once in a while, i.e. when the player is not there, they are displaced in time to the next session that the player could make it. And obviously, in the middle of, like, a tense combat, if that character is, like, needed, then they would show up and you could use them. The other players could run them, but, overall, like, I think that's a satisfying enough thing. And you can also explain it that, like, well, technically, their timeline operates as if they were traveling with the party the whole time. And anytime that, like, they're, like, and they only disappear down the time stream when their presence wouldn't have changed anything. Something like that. That way you can make arguments for, like, when it is important that they're there, they'll appear. And you don't have to do important story bits when the player isn't there, stuff like that. But that's, I think, a reasonable solution, but it's really character specific and it's after the fact. So what if you go into a campaign already knowing this? Well, I guess you can design a character around it. Like, something that comes to mind. Okay, your character has to get disabled on occasion when the player isn't there. And then either they have to be easy to, like, carry the character around, like, in some sort of transportable state. Or maybe you could have the first solution where other players run the character, and you have really specific rules in place that character can't, like, fully die in a combat where the player isn't there. Now, that could get metagamey, where, like, you're always like, okay, Jeffrey can't die because his player isn't here, so we're going to send him into the middle of a bunch of goblins to tank everything. Like, that's not good. But if you try to play normally, and it's just, if the character dies, they don't fully die, and maybe it's easier to resurrect them, or any number of different things like that. But, okay, so you have to have the character disabled. Maybe Like, for example, they're like a Dampier or a Reborn or something like that, and they have to periodically go into a sleep, into a torpor state, like into a hibernation, or they're a werebear or something, something. They have some biological reason, or magical, that they have to hibernate, and they go into a coffin or a ring or, some sort of thing that is either reasonably carried around or that very easily carried around, like a ring. And the character disappears when the player isn't there, and when the player is there, they pop back out of it. Something like that. There's lots of different ways you could go about it, but if you bake that into a character's backstory and design, it'll feel a lot more natural, I guess. Or there's ways to make it feel more natural instead of retrofitting some sort of excuse that the character disappears sometimes, something like that. So that's the idea there. Otherwise, normally I would just say, okay, just let them run the character, but because having a difficult schedule isn't that shouldn't stop you from really playing D&D, you know what I mean? This tastes like fridge. Dumping that when I get home. So there's lots of different, just come up with some reason. Start with a reason why your character would disappear sometimes. Maybe, or do something like what Critical Role has done with Pike in Campaign 1, where, the character is off repairing this temple, but in times of need, i.e. when the player can make it, the character of Pike could kind of astrally project in a divine manner to the party's location. That, I think, worked really well. And something like that, it requires a small bit of planning, I guess. Maybe you give the party a particular item that binds them to that cleric, for example. That way, it's not that way the party won't really ask about, oh, well, they can just astrally project anywhere we need them to, right? No, it's only to where the party is. Or maybe it's the connection they have with the party, something like that. Which, that might not work on session 3. Where the characters aren't really all that close yet. But a little bit of planning anytime they set out into, away from town or their home base. Well, I guess the cleric kind of has to stay behind just so that they can astrally project. And then effectively they never actually leave the town, which can have its own interesting implications. Or maybe the character is purely an astral projection of something, the fragment of some old, the creation of an old wizard that's their wizard tower / laboratory is buried miles underground and has been sealed off for centuries, but something woke up down there, maybe a homunculus or something, some sort of artificial created life form that is the player's actual character, but they can use devices and all sorts of magical artifacts in that laboratory to astrally project outward. How they meet the party, I don't know. And then eventually you plant that little idea of, okay, eventually the party will have to get to this laboratory to free the character for real. something like that. So that lines up a future plot hook. That's actually I actually like that one a lot. But something like that. There's tons of solutions. You just got to come up with something. Imagination. But yeah, just wanted to kind of discuss some of those ideas.